Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the show for analytically minded marketers. Let's get straight into today's talk, going from Armageddon to alignment with GA4. Since July 1st of 2023, those of us involved with web analytics felt a seismic shift. We're still reeling from that change. I'm talking, of course, about transitioning to Google Analytics 4. A lot of us considered it an Armageddon of digital measurement, mostly because GA4 wasn't a new version of an old tool, but it was a completely different platform. And it was a very young tool. In fact, at the time, it was still a toddler in human years. But in the 2 years since then, it has grown rapidly. Some of us are feeling it's getting a chance to mature. Many marketers took their licks in that forced transition to GA4, but they're the same ones who, despite those raw emotions, are now trying to make the hard changes in our reporting. GA4 might be the change we didn't know we needed. Our guest grew up in the New York's tri-state area, and that gave him two passions. The first one is hockey and watching people grow up playing the game they love. He's a lifelong Islanders fan, and working in Manhattan, he also got to work a lot with numbers. Over time, he morphed from analyzing financial data to analyzing digital marketing in tools like Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics. He built this expertise in industry giants like American Express Travel and Entertainment's NBC Universal. Wanting to use these skills without the constraints of being in a big corporation, he went independent and he relocated to Las Vegas, where he now gives all kinds of companies insight into their analytics data. So let's now go and talk with Neil Shapiro. Welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Thanks, Glenn. Happy to be here. It's been a while.
Yeah, for sure. And Neil, we're going to get into what you do, but what I want to start with is an explanation of the experience that companies have in the field that you work in, which is web analytics, and the experience, of course, since 2023, specifically July 1st of 2023, is that the only tool that they could even view for their analytics, if they're like most of the world out there, is Google Analytics version 4. And they brought this into play. We had something like maybe, if you read the tea leaves right, you could have had maybe 2.5 years of advance notice. But they had explained it as a new version. So they just called it Google Analytics 4. And when you read their post, there was some revisionist naming of their older platform, Universal, to be GA3. And then they explained, this is part of an entire evolution of the same platform. But when pressed to it, they admitted Google Analytics 4 is actually an entire new software code. It's an entirely new backend data structure. It's all new. It's not a V4 of anything. It's a V1. And this is taking something that people had been used to using for a decade and a half as their go-to tool, which was the universal Google Analytics. And then on a relatively short time frame, switching it all up. You have a name for what this did to the industry. Would you kindly tell me kind of how you characterize it in one word?
The word is Armageddon.
Yeah.
It was like panic. Like, what do we do? Help.
Yeah. So let's take a minute and kind of go through the magnitude, because depending on where people are, maybe they felt certain parts of it and not others. But what people really stepped into Well, I think it's like this. If I remember when I first got, I think, Classic Analytics and then Universal, it was I dropped a little bit of code on a website, made sure that it was somewhere that every page, it got populated. And then next thing I knew, I was opening up a UI and seeing some pretty fleshed out charts. And that's kind of what I, did. And I helped many companies, you did too, go through that process. And for companies that were just going along on their journey, that seemed extremely intuitive. The code, that little bit of JavaScript enables messages to get across from actions the website user takes. And now I can actually start to see what actions are happening on my site that are useful. I can take the ones that are really important and tell that tool itself that I want them to be a conversion. And then all the time, it would just make a conversion out of it, report on those conversions, attribution, all that. And like it was the one size fits all Swiss Army knife of analytics.
Yes.
GA4 comes. And I'm told now that a tool which kind of sat beside GA, Tag Manager, Google Tag Manager, that a whole lot of things that I could have always done inside of Universal Analytics, I now have to really use Tag Manager to use. Okay, so now we're at 2 products. And then I'm told, well, we have, if my charts need to reference external data or they need to be a little bit more sophisticated than the Google Analytics itself can do, I need to go and look at Looker Studio, which is another whole different product. And then if I want to get kind of the back end of that data, like I used to use, there were Google Sheet add-ons where I could go and grab all the universal data and just have it flood right in. For that, I was told, well, to really get the data in a usable format, I need to now switch into using a data warehouse product. And they say, well, there's Google BigQuery. Now they tie it into the Google Analytics, and it's a fairly solid connector, but it's another product. And if I want anybody else's data, I'm going to have to go through an intermediary API tool that's going to go and connect to all those other. So what have I lost count? I'm at 4 or 5 now.
Yeah,
at
I
least.
think you're at 4, 5.
So long story short, an experience that a company is going to have today, just doing the same things they did 10 years ago, is vastly different. Have I got that right?
You're 100% correct.
Okay.
We've gone to this. Let's use the term big data.
Yeah.
Because we're collecting more of it now.
And for those who are yearning for the good old days, like I guess we can, you and I can count ourselves among that crowd. We want to yearn for the good old days, but I guess the hard truth of it is those days aren't coming back.
No.
So what do we have to get, first off, do we really have to all by ourselves learn all this new technology? Or I'm starting to bargain now. I'm trying to figure out how little can I get away with giving up? If I really can't ever get back to that simple view of the world, how do I what are the first couple of steps that I should take to encounter this brave new world?
One is, I think from a mindset perspective, if you're a practitioner or you're a marketing person, is get uncomfortable and at least at a minimum, sit there and at least educate yourself on the GA4 metrics because they are different. And then I like to use the term is just start and practice. And also, the old world was wonderful. This is the new world. And there are just more and more levels to it that as GA4 is this evolving product, there's going to be something new every few weeks. And you have to say to yourself, where do your priorities lie as a practitioner?
Right.
or as
Right.
we could flip it to a marketing person is, what data do I need to be able to tell the right story?
Correct. So, and in fairness, for those old enough to remember, the very first years of Universal Analytics, they were making constant changes to that product too. But the one that most of us know was a mature, in fact, even aging product. And so it didn't see, like, they literally let go of, the developers who'd been working on it. They got pulled onto other teams, and Universal was solid almost by neglect.
Yeah.
And there were some things about it that could be misleading. And there were also things about it that missed entirely new phenomena in a marketer's world. Mobile apps,
Hmm.
Apple's ITP, which is, restricting on things like
Yep.
cookie preservation. So I guess we need to declare the warts that Universal had if we're going to give a fair assessment of how it and GA4 compared to each other.
Well, here was from everything that I read over the last few years was, you know, we're in this age of privacy, and Google took a long-term look at UA and said, okay, we need to get this compliant now, especially like in the EU. Otherwise, we're going to lose this entire market
Yep.
because it was, I think at one point, basically, the EU said shut it down. And they, let's say, rushed, I wouldn't say rushed to market. They started developing it. And as the EU was starting to push the envelope back to Google, they're like, okay, here's our end date of
Right.
July 1,
Right. Call
and
off the dogs.
yeah, call off the dogs. We're going to get compliant, and there just was this with some of my interactions with clients. They were really really upset, and it was like, okay, what do we do? And because let's call it pre end date, I was fortunate enough to work. A bunch of my friends have websites. I said, do you mind if I implement and at least come up with a schema for GA4, even realizing that if you're going to migrate to GA4, you have to use Google Tag Manager. I really don't. A lot of people like, why?
Yep.
And I said, one is you don't have to worry about the initial script. Like if they change the initial, remember one point they
Right.
changed, like
It'll
it'll
break.
be there.
Yeah.
Let's use the term future proofing. I said you future proof the site. Then it looked great in terms of enhanced measurement. I'm like, okay, we don't need to create all these tags. Well, lo and behold, as I was testing and learning, enhanced measure, oh, we don't have to write a tag for form submits.
Correct.
That is not the case at all.
Not always. But let's even just look at
Sure.
how that whole admin section of analytics works differently. I agree with you. I'd characterize Universals more as a lock, stock, and barrel. So
Yeah.
its ability to grab um, a form submit or reaching of a destination page, or bring in a little bit of user ID data.
Hmm.
Like Universal had it all, and if you wanted to take out a part of it, you couldn't because it was an all-in-one. In the backend admin of GA4, I've got the ability to turn signals on and off. I've got
Hmm.
enhanced measurement, turn it on and off. Data import, data retention, like all of these. And I read a lot into the fact that Google is expecting the website analytics person to take responsibility for that. They can, stand up in front of the EU and say, they turned it on, we didn't. And I think that's part of what GA4's architecture was meant to do, was to insulate them from those headaches regarding privacy
Yes.
because now it's not their problem, it's the responsibility of the user.
Yes, and I've heard online. I've seen some stories where some companies in the EU have gotten fined because
Right.
of settings.
Yep.
They just
Yep.
didn't set the settings right.
And I mean, we can take this into audiences too. Google will make it a quite straightforward for importing your own customer data as an audience, and there's a lot of integrations now between Google Ads and Google Analytics audiences.
Yeah.
But you might want to ask your internal legal counsel whether or not you
Yes.
had permission to do that.
I've seen that come across online numerous times, or some video. Some practitioner in a YouTube video will say, make sure you speak to your legal team. That's like the open disclosure these days
Right.
when we're working with that data.
Yeah, just that. So, I guess they're making it so that you can have a few new things to do. But they are squarely placing all of that on you. And they're yeah, I suppose what we should remember is that compared to the early days of the internet, where almost nobody was paying attention to what uh, analytics was doing, we live in a world now where people are paying attention.
Yes.
And we've got things like Cambridge Analytica and, Brexit votes and other things like that to show us why they're paying attention. And I can't say I blame them.
A simple, let's call it use case right now. I'm working with one client in the financial services sector, and we were going through about 2 weeks ago. It's a very slow process, but I was looking at their specs again, and I said, it's okay for the email address to go from one input on one page to the next landing page. I said, that is where it stops. I said, that is strictly forbidden in GA4. You're not allowed to collect email addresses.
Yeah.
And I looked through the other data in the forms, and I said, just for your own peace of mind, I said, just bring it back to your legal team and have them just double check it. Like, here's what we could put on the form. Here's what we're allowed to collect. End of story. So that way they're covered.
Yeah. Tell me, do you think that consent mode is, it was trotted out as being a cure. Do you think it actually has some good enough pieces to it that we can make sure that, let's say, the jurisdiction of the person, is very tight on consent, we're at least observing what they've asked us to do rather than us being the only ones holding the hot potato of, okay, can I take that email address?
I feel that consent is really, how do I want to phrase this? Consent could be good and it can be bad, but what I have noticed working with a different client is they have the CDP implemented,
Yep.
and I kind of scratch my head because the CDP is pulling in a lot of, let's call it, geographic and demographic data that to me is almost skirting the line.
Hmm.
And I get a little like, I just wonder where we're going to go from. I'm wondering if this, like, CDP's evolution is that it's trying to skirt consent to aggregate more data into a marketing database so people can be remarketed to.
Yeah. Yeah. So did they give us an inch and we took a mile?
Yeah, exactly. That's what it feels. Based on what I could see in the data layer,
Yeah.
doing a lot of QA testing, I'm like, okay, so this is getting real interesting now.
So I suppose, and you and I both take this view, Yeah, the tech is definitely there. I mean, we haven't even talked about server-side tag management, but you can even take that into account when you want people to, you want data going certain places and not to others. Um, but I suppose what we should be using these new features that are around for is to spark a discussion in our org to say, okay, what can we do? What can't we do? And how are we going to thread this needle? How do
Exactly.
you, yeah?
It's how do you let's say it's how do you systemically close the gaps, and how do you systemically close or systemically create the story that everybody needs to hear.
Yeah. I like that. And kind of bringing in consent again. So I can see the conversation going, we have not got a way to connect. We've got big gaps in our story of a customer's journey. And so we can do one thing. We can either go to management and say, here are the pieces, the fragments of the story, but we don't have the rest, and be prepared for the blowback. Or if we feel that strongly, and maybe our own manager does as well, knowing how it'll land, maybe what we can do is explicitly go to the user and get consent and explain why. Not because we're going to remarket to them, but because there's actually something in the logged in session experience which matters enough to the relationship that we have that we want that piece of data. And, like that kind of, we're using market forces to make sure that we have a complete enough story, and that our version of complete story isn't just, well, because we want to have our hands on all the data. No, it's that we feel it's a fair exchange with the customer.
Yeah, it also comes down to, and this is something that I've been part of some conversations with some practitioners, is bringing more value to analytics across the organization and even back to the end user and customer. It just seems like organizations still in this mindset of analytics can be the afterthought.
Yeah.
And what I've found lately is uh, working with one group is the analytics was completely neglected, and we're trying to piece together a customer journey. And out of the box, I just was scratching my head going, we don't even have a complete shopping cart journey. And just to put it out there, this was an Adobe implementation. This wasn't even a GA4 implementation, and based on the chatter, I'm going, well, they just did not or weren't willing to make that investment to have aligned data. And now here we are forced to kind of string together a story, but then come back to them and say, look, um, you need to have an implementation engineer look at this to close these gaps. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like out of scope, but it's the truth of what is really going on.
Yeah. So glad you used an Adobe example there to drive home. It's not the tech.
Yeah,
Um, but I also like the word you used in there, aligned. And alignment is where you say it is possible to get, even after Armageddon, when we're trying to pull back the historical data that giving our period over period graphs to, I know some of those quarter over quarter and definitely year over year, they're still looking ugly in a lot of companies, but we will move past that. What sorts of things do you see as being most common among the companies that have gotten used to this new way of working and are now firing on all cylinders?
those companies looked at it from two aspects. One is that they had made the initial investment, and their analytics teams were well equipped in terms of, okay, we need to make this transition. So let's start with, okay, we're going to grab, as the way I viewed it is, and let's look at it from a high level, you know, enterprise organization where there's the investment dollars there to say, okay, we're going to
Ah,
invest the time.
right,
All right, we're going to map this out. We
right.
have our ideal state in the old world. All right, we need to map it into the new world. And what does that look like?
Okay. And
And
am I
then,
hearing right when you're trying to put a value on each one of those data pieces? It's kind of threshing out uh, your wants from your needs. Like if you
yeah,
can't justify that, like what that data will give us, what we could actually do from a decision or from a uh, experience, a user experience standpoint. If we can't say what that is, then that data is not coming back.
exactly. And I always felt one of the biggest where people got really upset was a lot of organizations. Um, I don't want to use the term siloed, but you had groups that kind of built in their own UA reports within UA,
Yep.
and then they looked at GA4 and they were just like, you know, a little kid drops their ice cream cone. That's the way I could describe it. And I would say to them, okay, there's the best way to approach this is you're going to have to get uncomfortable because this is the new world, but let's look at it. All right, let's bring the story into Looker Studio to make your lives easier. And they were like, okay, I would create a quick report and
Yep.
say this, and but also what I would say to them is one is at least with Looker, it's a little bit more scalable in terms
Yeah,
of
and I think so. Just for those who
sure,
might be partial to GA4, there is the Explore tab. But I
yeah,
think you and I, Neil, we feel that for the work that you would need to set up an exploration report, you it's not going to take you much longer if you just had done it in Looker Studio.
yeah, and also again with exploration, if you're just trying to create a one-off ad hoc piece, um, from a scalability standpoint, it just like the columns don't even resize the right way.
Yep.
And I'm taking my glasses off, looking at the screen. I'm going, this
Yep.
doesn't work for me.
Yep. Yep. They're sharing. It doesn't retain data as long.
Yeah,
There's a number of things. So okay, so Looker Studio, and at this point, uh, let's say that they have third-party data. How is that getting into Looker Studio? Are they investing in platforms to do that?
some of them because of the way they were, again, the investment that the organization made internally. Yeah, they've found connectors that work for them that integrate well.
And
Um,
invested, because either time or money, you're going to pay either way.
yeah, you're going to pay either way, but they kind of understood this is what it looked like in the old world, and they were willing to accept the new world,
Yep.
understanding, you know, that your ROI is always going to be on the back end of it, not on the front end. Like especially if you're building out, high level reports for the exec teams, I always say it's, if you can get it to them in 4 clicks of the mouse, they're thrilled.
Yep. Yep. Um, what does it look like if some of that external data is ads data, like Meta? Because it's a pretty well-known phenomenon that GA4 seems to be, at least in terms of convenience for information, preferring Google Ads over others. Um, and it even goes into attribution. Data-driven attribution is now the only game in town on GA4, and we don't know what it is really doing. So it must be, or I have to infer that it's giving Google Ads the rosiest possible treatment Because otherwise, why would you even have a data-driven, like, if you're going to black box it, that would seem to suggest that there's something that you don't want to be sharing with everybody, because they would then be able to see what that ads platform is really doing versus what
Hmm.
you say it's doing.
So it is interesting, Glenn, and I'm just thinking back. Is I'd have to look, but I could put money on it that they did create a meta connector for GA4
Ah,
recently.
okay.
Now, here, again, this is Google trying to be all encompassing and making everybody happy. Now, Google Ads, on the other hand, you know, there's two thoughts here. One is the data is, for GA4, it's a simple connection. But then also you've got the ads platform user interface, which to me can get really convoluted and very frustrating.
Yeah.
So I've gone back to clients because in some cases the clients are like, we've got access to ads data, but we can't figure out a way to really report on it, and the UI is frustrating. I said, okay, well, we can connect it to Looker,
Yeah.
and they seem really thrilled. But in terms of meta, it's you know the attribute. What I think, what I should say, what I feel as a practitioner, what this comes down to is going to basically, let's call it an old school method. Let's look at the meta ad data on its own and see its
Right.
performance, and then let's pull everything out of GA4 where we could see it's Facebook, and measure that performance, and
Yeah.
then make our best assumptions, and then go from there.
I can't help but agree. I think, well, this seems to be the same thing that is happening with AI, machine learning, and
Yeah.
a fair bit of it. I mean, for anybody who's wondering, does GA4 show me 100% of my users? No.
No.
Most reports you're looking at, there is sampling, and it's taking a sample and then filling in gaps with AI. Uh, this is like really changing our relationship with these tools. Your old school approach of looking at metadata separately and then uh, analytics data for Google Ads, and then in your head trying to see, well, at least directionally,
Hmm.
which one is strong and in what mode. Um, we're going to have to do this anyway, because both that metadata and that Google Ads data is itself being synthesized by AI. So I think I would prefer doing that and taking responsibility as a protein-based life form, rather than handing those two synthesized data sets to another AI and imagining that it's going to tell me what to do.
You're exactly correct, and I feel it starts to become a little bit of a lost art. Um, I feel that, let's use the term loosely. There's some level of AI data crunching codependency now,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I feel that, especially if you are internally involved in the organization and you know the business well, you should be able to take those data sets,
right.
look at them, and draw logical conclusions, versus using AI as the crutch to say, well, this is what AI is saying. And like, but AI doesn't know the org.
Yeah,
AI doesn't exactly know the business flow. So I think we're going to come to a tipping point of, you're going to have that school of AI, let AI do all the heavy lifting, and then you have the school of, let's do it the old fashioned way. Let's dump it out, and let's just do our own crunching and draw,
yeah.
probably our own internal instincts are going to be better than AI's.
Right. And I think it's actually going to be feasible, because the kind of data that those, especially the attribution reports, are going to give us, They're more high level. We are no longer in the days of Universal where you could get individual IP addresses or
Yeah,
even IP address level data. You're
yeah.
getting, so you're going to have to roll it up. But rolling up is actually good because that is more going to be like that's more in line with what our heads do for like dead reckoning, like
Hmm.
mental math, right? Does that number look right? Looks a little high. Oh, I noticed that we included internal traffic. Ah, okay, back that out. That looks more right. So I think we can get there. Um, and when we're taking those pieces of data together and we're you know pushing it into tools like Google Looker Studio and then looking at it and seeing does it pass the sniff test. I feel like we're getting close to what you were saying about how it can now tell a story. Could you maybe tell us what you see as good hallmarks for companies that have now got that data set into it's aligned with their user journey and they can now tell that whole story?
What it comes down to, Glenn, is when you have everything aligned, the story you are telling is what the organization needs to hear. In some cases, let's just use this as kind of like an open use case where um, company is investing heavily in Google Ads, and you know everybody thinks Google Ads is like the panacea to drive more conversions, and you go in and you go look at you know the data, and you start to realize that the ads weren't driving the needle,
Right,
pushing
right.
conversions. And years ago, here's a very an analytical case where uh, e-commerce company was spending money on ads, pull all the data, and they were wasting money. They were converting more organically than they were converting more from paid.
Huh.
And I'm honest, and they were furious at me. And I said, "This is," I sat there on the call. I'm like, "I'm telling you the truth here."
Yeah.
And they were like, "Well, like," I said, "It's not like the ads were wrong. It's just like economically, you know, think of it this way. In that case, this organization should have looked at their organic conversions over time and then said incrementally, if I go spend money on ads, is it going to be worth it?" And they just threw a whole pile of cash. They
Right.
did make some money, but the ROI was negative.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And that's because someone made an assumption,
Yes.
and they were sorely proven wrong. Um, don't assume. So I can see how we're all going to have to get used to the data that we're now seeing challenging our older beliefs. But we have to think that it might just as much be how this tool or suite of tools is now letting us see the data as it really should be seen, um, not the way we wanted to see it. So maybe in the past with Universal, in our kind of oversimplified world, we had rose-colored glasses on,
Mm-hmm.
and now we don't. Now we're seeing the unvarnished data as it is. Um, can you promise me that there won't be any more changes, Neil?
That I cannot promise you, my friend. That that is just like, and let's call it the power of LinkedIn, and the practitioners of GA4. Some of them, it's like, I, you know, I think they eat, live, and breathe it 24/7, 365. And as soon as the change comes out, the chatter just picks up, and you just kind of your head drops. I'm like, really?
Right, right. Well, but let's be thankful because I think it's a much more robust community than it was in the early days of
Yes.
Universal. Um, and we're dealing with a bigger Google now, a Google that, frankly, stands to lose more than they gain. So we're taking them to task, and I think they've heard us. Um, Now, remains to be seen whether or not the changes that they're going to make are going to be ones that um, enrich their own pockets or are ones that uh, actually make the analytics ecosystem stronger. Maybe a mix of both. But I think we do have to get used to the fact that there's going to be more change. And like our good old friend Darwin said, it's not, our ability uh, to have the changes which that new regime is going to need. It's our ability to adapt
Mm-hmm.
to an ever changing regime that's going to be our ace in the hole.
Yes. Yes. And the one thing I will say is that adaption means to adopt means you have to get uncomfortable. And at the
Right.
pace of the releases, and I like to say when I work with newer clients, and I say this to a lot of practitioners, don't get comfortable. They're going to push you to get out of your comfort zone and learn something new,
Mm-hmm.
because they're
Mm-hmm.
going to make an ask that you've never heard before. And then, okay, now let's go solve for that ask. And what am I learning that I'm going to bring into the next engagement?
Yeah. And so I think what we're going to probably be deprioritizing are those old year over year trend trend series. We're going to probably have time series that are shorter, but we also need to pay attention to opportunities. So
Yes.
they roll out a new UTM parameter. They roll out a new way of incorporating third party data. Um, we we can make hay out of those just as much
Yeah.
as uh, we notice, the things that they take away that, as you say, brings an avalanche of spite on LinkedIn. So I guess we have to look at each one of them case by case, and each
Mhm.
company's, feeling about that change
Yeah. Yeah.
is going to be different. So you got to look at it for your own use.
Yeah. I think the most important thing that in this journey is the fact that everything now with GA4 is predicated on the implementation.
Right.
That is
So
just so key.
yeah, so you get those tags correctly set up. You get your variables and triggers. You get what you need across on the data layer. You get the right custom dimensions set
Hmm.
up within GA4, and then you make sure that it's all flowing across properly for whatever you do for reporting. You're saying that uh, if you don't feel that that's rock solid, that that's going to compromise your ability to tell the whole story.
Yes,
Yeah,
especially with GA4, especially with GA4.
right, right. We're no longer in this babysitter. Don't worry, Universal's done it for you. No, this is roll your own.
Yes, and the one thing, well, the one thought that comes to mind, especially with GA4, and where I get some pushback, why does testing take so long? I say no, and especially from a Google Tag Manager perspective, I said it's because you're now working in a box in terms of when you build that tag and create that custom event, it's got to be right. You can't afford to make the mistake like in the Universal where, okay, just delete the tag and start over again. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you use the tools, so Tag Manager again, very robust, and if you use it properly, the payoff is that Google will not come along and all of a sudden break its own GTM config tag. So you can
Yeah.
at least not worry about that. But you do have to worry about everything that you say uh, in the no code interface that they give you. You have to actually go through and get all of that. So you want your tag assistant on, you want to look through everything, you want to debug as much as you can so that you know that at least you've got that data flowing.
Yeah. I mean, because again, we go back to if you don't have great data, you're not going to be able to tell the story. it's a very binary thought process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Neil, if people want to find out more of this type of stuff that you talk about and do, where can we send them?
You can go to the website zendigitalanalytics.com. You can book a call, send me an email. More than happy to talk to anybody out there in the world. Even if they're just looking for simple advice, more than happy to lend my opinion. Find me on LinkedIn. Very, easy to find on LinkedIn. Those are the two main platforms where you can really hit me up. Social media is still a little bit of a work in development for me right now.
Yeah. Neil, I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @FunnelReboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.